70-742 Lesson 8 Configuring Group Policy Processing. So in Lesson 7 we learned how to create GPOs and the fact that we could back them up, we can restore them, we can copy, we can import. There's many different things that we can do with group policy objects, and we learned how there's two sections to them in that we can have computer policies and user policies. So let's take a little bit deeper dive into how those policies actually get applied. So we're going to be looking at configuring processing order and precedence, how we can use filters, configuring security filtering and WMI filtering. We touched upon these methods in Lesson 7. We'll be looking at loopback processing as well as configuring the client-side extension behavior. And finally, we'll be looking at troubleshooting group policies as well as how we force a group policy update and how we can do modeling and check the results of group policies against a computer without actually having to even log on to the computer. So let's take a look at some of the key terms that you're going to need to understand for this lesson. And first and foremost, client-side extensions. Group policies are client-driven, which means that the group policy client pulls the GPOs from the domain, which triggers processes called client-side extensions, CSEs, that interrupt the settings in a GPO and make the changes to the local computer or the currently logged on user. When Active Directory is installed, two domain GPOs are created by default: the default domain controller policy and the default domain policy. The default domain controller, this policy is linked to the domain. It affects all users and computers in the domain, including domain controllers. The default domain policy is installed in the same way, and it affects all users and computers in the domain as well. It specifies the password, account lockout, and Kerberos policies. Understand that the default domain policy can only be configured at the domain level. Likewise, the default domain controller policy can only be configured at the domain level, and it contains the default user rights assignments for the domain. Inheritance. By default, a group policy uses what's called inheritance, in which settings are inherited from the container above. We looked at this in Lesson 7, whereas if you have objects in an organizational unit structured below the domain root, any policies applied to the domain root will be inherited by that organizational unit. Loopback processing. This is used to assign user policies to computer objects. Therefore, no matter who logs onto a computer, the user policies are applied to the computer. Merge mode. The user settings defined in the computer's GPOs and user settings normally applied to the user are combined. If the settings conflict, the user settings in the computer's GPO take precedence over the user's normal settings. This mode is useful to apply additional settings to users' typical configurations, such as mapping additional printers, replacing wallpaper on a computer, or disabling certain applications or devices in a conference room or reception area. Replace mode. The user settings defined in the computer's GPO replace the user settings normally applied to the user. The replace mode is useful in a situation such as a kiosk, classroom, or public library where users should receive a standard configuration. RSOP, resultant set of policy. You can access this by running rsop.msc. This gathers the actual policies that are applied to a computer and the user that logs onto that computer. Security group filtering. This specifies which users, computers, or groups based on access control lists receive a group policy object. WMI. This is Windows Management Instrumentation. It's a component that extends the Windows driver model to provide an interface to the operating system to provide information and notification on hardware, software, operating systems, and services. We saw this illustrated in Lesson 7, where a policy that contained Windows 10 settings, would, through WMI filtering, only get applied to Windows 10 computers. WMI filtering configures a GPO to be applied to certain users or computers based on specific hardware, software, operating systems, and services. As we saw in Lesson 7, group policies are defined using group policy objects. And these are a collection of instructions that your computer processes. It may contain computer configurations or user configurations. We link it to an Active Directory container at the site, domain, or organizational level. We can control which group policy affects a computer or user. We can use several mechanisms to scope a GPO. That may be the way that it's linked to the site, domain, or organizational unit. We can have the link enabled or disabled. We can use the enforce option of a GPO, the block inheritance option, which we looked at in Lesson 7. We're going to take a deeper look into all these processes in Lesson 8. Security group filtering, WMI filtering, loopback policy processing, and preferences targeting. We'll see more about preferences in Lesson 10. Now, we've touched upon this before, but understand that when configuring group policies, the settings are applied to the computer or the user. Computer configuration settings are processed when a computer starts, and user configuration settings are processed when a user logs on. Group policies are processed in the following way. As we just stated, when a computer first starts up, it establishes a secure link between the computer and a domain controller. The computer then obtains a list of group policy objects that can be applied to the computer. Computer configuration settings are applied synchronously. That means one by one. During computer startup, before the logon dialog box is presented to the user. If any startup scripts are configured through GPOs, it is at this time that those scripts are processed. And they're processed synchronously, that is one by one, and have a default timeout of 600 seconds or 10 minutes to complete. Because the user has not logged on yet, the process is hidden. Until all those scripts and GPOs are processed, you will not receive a Control-Alt-Delete option. It is only after the computer configuration settings have been applied and the startup scripts have been applied that the users will see the Control-Alt-Delete option to log on. So if you ever run into an issue where a user reports that their computer is simply sitting there and it won't give them a logon prompt, double check, make sure that there are no new scripts being applied to that user's computer. Remember, these are all computer configurations that are being processed. If an administrator did enable a script that takes a long time to run, this can drastically affect the ability of users to log on in an expeditious manner. Once that Control-Alt-Delete option is available, the user is authenticated and the user profile is then loaded. The computer obtains a list of group policy objects that need to be applied to the user. And here again, the GPO processing is hidden from the user. After the user policies run, any logon scripts defined by the GPOs then run. And unlike computer scripts, those scripts run asynchronously. That means multiple scripts may be processed at the same time. The logon script defined for the user in Active Directory user properties is executed, and finally, the desktop is displayed. When it comes to group policy inheritance, remember LSDOU, LSDOU, LSDOU. This is the order in which policies get applied. L for local group policy, S for site, D for domain, OU for organizational unit, LSDOU. Filtering with group policies. Now, we discussed this before. Group policies flow down. They flow from the upper containers to the lower objects. However, you may want to define a group policy and not want them to be overwritten by other GPOs, or you might not want the GPO to flow down to the lower containers. We looked at this in Lesson 7, where we saw the example of blocking inheritance, where if we had an organizational unit where we wanted to test settings or perhaps have different settings applied, we could block inheritance of the upper level policies at the domain level and specify specific group policies that we wanted to be applied at the organizational unit layer. Additionally, you can disable enforcing a GPO. Let's scroll down to where they talk about that. Now here's your text. Suppose you want to apply a GPO and you do not want that GPO to be overridden by a GPO that's executed later. So for example, you've got a GPO at your domain level and another GPO at the organizational unit layer that has similar settings, but the settings are configured differently. By enforcing the GPO link, the GPO takes the highest precedence, which will prevail over any conflicting policy set in other GPOs. In addition, an enforced link applies to child containers even when those containers are set to block inheritance. Let's move on to security filtering and WIM filtering. By default, group policy settings are applied to all child objects within the container to which they're linked. Although you need to organize your OUs to help you manage your resources, you sometimes need to have granular control that allows you to specify which clients, that could be a computer or set of computers or a set of users, the group policy applies to. So we looked at this in Lesson 7. Security group filtering. By default, when you link a group policy, it gets applied to all authenticated users. You can remove that and specify the security group that it applies to. By using that security group access control list, you can determine who or what that GPO is applied to. Additionally, we can use WMI filtering. This controls who or what a GPO is applied to, just as in the case or example in Lesson 7 we reviewed where a policy was only applicable to Windows 10. Additionally, remember that different versions of Windows have different file structures. And at some point we may discuss a feature called a software restriction policy. For example, as you can see on your screen, software restriction policy for Windows 7. A software restriction policy defines what can write to certain restricted areas of the operating system. At a time, Windows XP was still in use in this company. To help enhance the security, we defined a software restriction policy for any Windows XP computer. This was a primary method for defeating ransomware. However, the structure as to where those files and folders existed was different than in Windows 7. So we had to define two different policies, one for Windows 7, one for Windows XP. How did we differentiate those? Through WMI filtering. The Windows XP policy was filtered to only apply to Windows XP computers, and the Windows 7 policy, very similar in nature, was defined to only apply to Windows 7 computers. Security group filtering specifies what users, computers, or groups based on access control lists receive a group policy object. Let's say we have a GPO that locks down a computer so the user can't access certain control panel applets on their computer. But an administrator or a technical support person, they might need to have access to those applets to perform their job. So we could use security filtering to apply certain settings to some users and not to others. Let's take a quick look at that. Let's take a look at security filtering. Here is a group policy object titled UPS WorldShip. UPS WorldShip is a shipping program for use to do just that, ship packages with UPS. It prints labels, creates the tracking number, and so on and so forth. However, to be able to operate this, UPS WorldShip very frequently pushes out updates to the program. For example, fuel rate changes or different types of address changes, and the client computer needs to be able to apply that executable change, that package change. Well, typically we don't allow a standard user to install updates, or at least updates of this type. This is from an application outside of our Windows Update. We can see here in the settings, if you remember from your A+ component, the user access control. This allowed the administrative approval to be elevated without prompting for allowing it. In this way, the UPS WorldShip computers that were members of the UPS WorldShip Computers security group would have the permissions to do those updates to that application, but any other computer that was not part of the security filtering would not have that privilege. Here's another example that we referenced in Lesson 7. Windows Update Services, WSUS. Their network applies them by location. And here we can see security filtering so that only those computers that are listed as a member of the Fort Lauderdale computers will get these settings. Now remember nesting security groups? We can see that there will be a corresponding Fort Lauderdale computer security group for that group policy, for Fort Myers, for Fort Pierce, and so on. They are all members of all company computers. So computers get added to these security groups, which in turn are members of all company computers. So as we saw in the example earlier in Lesson 7, where one group policy was filtered by all company computers, this is another way. You can have individual security groups. You can make them a member of another security group and then apply that at a different policy. Many different ways to be able to do your security filtering. Now, that WMI filtering, you can create your own. In fact, that is what I did. For example, using this command line, select all from Win32 operating system where Microsoft Windows XP Professional is found. That would pull out and apply to only Windows XP Pro computers. You can make it more granular by adding the and this CSD version Service Pack 3. So only Windows XP Professional computers with Service Pack 3 would get applied through this filter. Is it only a 32-bit machine? What if it's 64-bit architecture? Only computers running Windows 10. And this would apply to any version of Windows 10 if it was incremented. What if it only has you don't want to install an application and cause the computer to run out of disk space? So you could specify the minimum amount of space that must be free. WMI filtering can be very, very granular. There's a lot you can do with it. It's important to understand how to troubleshoot group policy objects, not only when something goes wrong, but to know that you will get the expected results that you want to have. So let's take a look at this. On a target computer, I can run a rsop.msc. Now I'm running this currently with special privileges. Notice I did not say administrative privileges. So we're going to allow this to complete, and so now we can see all the computer policy configurations, all the computer policies that are being applied. We can see if there's any error information. Looks like everything's good. We can right-click user configuration, see what policies are being applied to the user, if there's any errors. And we can drill in and view the specific policies that are being applied. And this will only show those policies that actually do have an assignment. For example, there's many here that are not defined, but there are some that are. If we look under user configuration, we can look into security settings. Right here's that software restriction policy, but it's not being applied. It's not active because this is a Windows 8 system, not a Windows XP or Windows 7. That's rsop.msc. Additionally, we can do a group policy results. We want to find out whether or not a policy is actually being applied correctly. So we select a computer and we select a user. Here's the wizard. Next, you say this or another computer that you want to run it against, the currently logged on user, or a specific user that has previously logged on to that computer. You will only get the results for a user that has previously logged onto that computer. If the computer's never been logged on by a user and user account has never been applied for that user to the computer, so there are no user settings for you to be able to get group policy results from. If we right click on this group policy results that was previously run, we can tell it to rerun. And just that quickly it ran. If I double click on it, it will generate a report showing me a different view. So this gives you the ability to reach out to another computer, pull out that user's settings as well as the computer settings to see what may be occurring. We can actually view the logs of the component processing. Let's take a look at this one here. Ran really quick, and there is all the calls for processing the group policies. And we can see exactly what's being applied. We can see exactly what group policies are being applied, which ones are not being applied. If we go down here, right here, denied group policy objects, the local group policy, that local GPO is being denied because we're part of a domain. There's a group policy for Microsoft Edge. Well, it was being denied. And you can see here the WMI filter for that policy. Microsoft Edge is being denied. Did Windows 8 have Edge? I believe it did. Why is it being denied? Right here under the WMI filter, we can see that Edge should only be applied if it's Windows 10. And the value came back false, so it will not apply. If we wish to model, we want to know what will the behavior be if we apply certain policies. We can specify what domain controller do we want to check this against. We can decide what container do we want to simulate it being a part of, and this is by organizational unit. We could do it at the top level, or we could specify what happens if we apply it to a certain OU, or we could do it against a specific user account. And in the same way for the computer, we can specify a specific OU or domain and see how the behavior will react. So if we just put in here, and I'm going to go with my account. And under computer, we're going to do this particular computer. We can simulate slow network connections. Perhaps it's a remote location. We can simulate that loopback processing that we were talking about. And are we going to do it in a replace mode or merge mode? We can specify what site do we want to simulate it being in. Gives us an option to change the network locations. We can simulate what security group we want to have it be a member of. What computer group do we want to have it a member of? Do we want to link specific WMI filters for computers, for users, WMI filters for computers, and then a summary of our selections, and then finally we can run that. These are all methods to do troubleshooting, to help you analyze the cumulative effect of GPOs and what those policy settings will be on a user or a computer in your organization. So, as you read through this section, make sure you understand that when configuring group policies, the settings are applied to the computer or the user. Computer configuration settings are processed on computer startup. User configuration settings are processed after a user logs on. In the example in lesson 7 where we showed a software installation of an application, understand that as a computer configuration setting, when that gets processed, many times that takes a restart for it to be completed. The group policy may say, here is a new application, download it. But how many applications require a restart? Since these are silent installs, the user may never know that. If a user indicates that they should have access to a new application and it's not there, ask them to restart the computer and see if it then does not appear. Understand that a computer and user can be affected by multiple GPOs and that they're processed in the order of LSDOU. LSDOU, LSDOU. Local group policy, then the site, domain, and organizational unit. If you're in a domain and you apply a default domain policy, the local group policy should be denied. By default, a group policy can use inheritance. You can prevent the inheritance of policy settings by blocking all group policy settings from the GPOs linked to parent containers in the group policy hierarchy. The loopback processing is used to assign user policies to computer objects, and therefore no matter who logs onto a computer, the user policies are applied to the computer. And as we saw just a few minutes ago, the RSOP, resultant set of policy, are the actual policies that are being applied to a computer and the user who logs onto that computer. Thank you for reviewing Lesson 8 in 70-742.